It was supposed to be a normal trip, but when a flight attendant rudely split up an elderly couple and wouldn't let them sit together, she had no idea who they were. She thought they were just another pair of old passengers who weren't important and could be ignored. But within hours, the whole plane would experience a shocking collapse that no one saw coming, and by the time the truth came out, it was too late. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today and if you like stories where powerful people are brought down, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Leonard and Evelyn Carter, an elderly couple, boarded their flight with their fingers lightly intertwined as they stepped into the first-class cabin. Leonard, wearing a crisp button-up shirt and a navy blazer, carried himself with quiet dignity. Evelyn, wearing a soft pink cardigan and pearl earrings, adjusted the strap of her purse and smiled at her husband. This trip had been planned for months and was a well-deserved vacation after years of hard work. They were finally able to book first-class seats next to each other so that they could enjoy their trip together. But when they got to their row, Evelyn's smile faded as she looked down at her ticket and then up at the seat numbers, her brows knitting together. Leonard checked his own ticket again and then looked at the seats in front of him. The airline had made a mistake. Instead of being seated next to each other, Evelyn was assigned a seat a row behind Leonard's. She turned to a nearby flight attendant who was a tall woman with blonde hair pulled back and sharp features. The name tag on her uniform said Miss Collins. Evelyn stepped forward and said, "Excuse me, dear. I think there's been a mistake. My husband and I booked our seats together, but we've been put in different rows." She held out her ticket to Miss Collins in the hopes of a simple fix. Miss Collins barely looked at it before sighing, "Seats are assigned ahead of time, ma'am. If you wanted to sit together, you should have booked them properly." Leonard's jaw tensioned a little, but his tone stayed calm. "We did." He pointed to the empty seat next to him and said, "If there's any way to switch my wife's seat to this one, we'd appreciate it." Miss Collins let out a sharp breath, her face getting angrier. "Sir, we don't make changes after boarding. You'll have to find someone willing to switch on your own," he said, making it sound like she didn't care about the request. Evan's lips were pursed into a thin line. "I understand policies, but this was an airline error." "Surely there'd be something you can do," Miss Collins replied. She quickly looked at her wife's ticket again and said, "Please take your assigned seats." A few people nearby looked up from their books or phones and watched the conversation in a subtly curious way. Some quickly turned away, while others exchanged quiet looks. Leonard sighed and adjusted his watch. He then reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a short message before sending it. Miss Collins didn't notice she was already on the phone. Leonard put his phone back in his pocket and walked down the aisle with the air of authority, as if the problem was solved. But it wasn't even close. Evelyn looked at him and saw something in his expression, the quiet patience that could only mean one thing: he wasn't going to argue, he was going to let things happen. She trusted him, so she adjusted her cardigan and took her seat, though disappointment lingered in her eyes for a few minutes as the cabin filled up. As the soft rustling of seats filled the aisle, Collins moved through it with the same stiff confidence, greeting some passengers and barely giving Evelyn or Leonard another glance. She made it clear who she thought was important in this cabin, and they were not on that list. Further up, flight attendant Daniel was handing out pre-flight drinks. Unlike Miss Collins, he did so with warmth, giving each passenger a smile along with their drink. When he got to Leonard, he noticed the empty seat next to him. Sir Daniel asked Leonard politely, "Would you like a drink before takeoff?" Leonard gave a small nod and said, "Water, please." Daniel handed him the glass and hesitated before adding, "I couldn't help but notice you and your wife seem to have been seated apart." Leonard took a sip of his water and then looked up at the attendant. Yes, we asked if there was a way to switch, but we were told it wasn't possible, Daniel said. Daniel's eyes flickered to Miss Collins, who was now in front of. He had worked with her for a long time and knew that she was strict to the point of arrogance and didn't care about passengers who didn't fit her idea of a worthy passenger. I see, Daniel said carefully. I can check to see if anyone would be willing to swap seats. Most people don't mind small changes. Before Leonard could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. Daniel, let's keep things moving, Miss Collins said from the front. No need to mess with the seating arrangements, she said. Miss Collins. Miss Collins had been with the airline much longer than he had, so he knew it wasn't a good idea to question her, but he didn't like how she handled the elderly couple. Leonard just smiled and said, "Don't worry about it, we'll be fine." Daniel gave a slow nod and moved on, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Miss Collins, on the other hand, had already moved on, telling her that the matter was over because she had answered and that was it. As the doors to the first-class cabin were about to close, the intercom went off. Miss Collins, please report to the cockpit immediately. The first-class cabin fell into a strange silence. Miss Collins stiffened her posture, but her steps became noticeably slower as she walked toward the front of the plane. Something was going on, and she was about to find out what. As she got closer to the cockpit door, her mind was racing. Calls to the cockpit before takeoff were rare, and they usually only meant there was either an emergency or a last-minute order from the airline's executives, neither of which she liked. She knocked once before going inside. Captain Richard Hayes, a seasoned pilot with salt and pepper hair, was sitting in his chair with his headset around his neck. Next to him, co-pilot Amanda Rhodes was monitoring the flight systems, but neither of them had asked Miss Collins to come in. On the small screen next to the flight panel, the live video feed showed a serious-looking. A man in a tailored navy blue suit filled the frame. Just the sight of him sent a chill down Miss Collins' spine. It was Benjamin Carter, CEO of Carter Airlines. Benjamin's voice was even, but there was an unmistakable weight to it. Could you explain why my parents have been separated on their own airline? The air inside the cockpit suddenly felt heavier, and Miss Collins blinked quickly, trying to process the words. His parents, Leonard and Evelyn Carter, own this airline. Wasn't sure who they were, sir, she stuttered, her usual sharp tone replaced with something much softer. It was a seating issue and I was just following protocol. Benjamin didn't react. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and asked, "Did you check the passenger manifest before turning down their request?" Miss Collins hesitated. The truth was that she hadn't. She had assumed, as she often did, that they were just another group of elderly passengers trying to make last-minute changes. "No, sir," she said, her voice weak. The silence on the other end of the car, which was barely above a whisper, made her stomach turn. Captain Hayes looked at Amanda and then cleared his throat. "Sir," he asked, "would you like us to make arrangements for their seats to be fixed now?" Benjamin's face was blank. "Yes, right away, and I want Miss Collins to personally escort them back to their rightful seats and apologize in front of the whole first-class cabin." Miss Collins felt a deep sense of shame creep up her spine. She had always calmed demanded authority on flights. She had always been in charge, but after one mistake she was helpless. "Understood, sir," she forced the words out. "Yes, sir," Benjamin nodded once, and then the screen went dark. Miss Collins turned back toward the cockpit door, her hands cold. She had made a mistake that would hurt her career, and now she had to walk back into that cabin and face the people she had snubbed. As she did, she could feel eyes moving toward her. The passengers could tell something had changed. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and walked down the aisle toward Leonard and Evelyn. The moment she ignored them, she unknowingly sealed her fate, and now the consequences were about to begin. Miss Collins walked down the aisle, her steps measured but noticeably slower than before. The first-class cabin, which used to be full of quiet conversations and the occasional clink of glasses, had become eerily quiet. Passengers could tell something was wrong. Some looked up from their screens, while others leaned forward out of curiosity. Leonard was sitting comfortably in his seat and lightly tapping the armrest. Leonard's expression was hard to read, but Evelyn, who was sitting behind him, had a soft, knowing smile on her face. She wasn't smug or angry, she was just patient. Miss Collins cleared her throat as she approached them and forced a polite smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said in a voice that was thinner than usual, "there's been a misunderstanding, and I've been told to move Mrs. Carter to her rightful seat." A few people looking at her husband exchanged looks. They had all heard how she had scolded the couple earlier, and now she was going back on her words. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not understanding what she was saying. Her tone was gentle, but there was something in her eyes that made Miss Collins' stomach twist. Miss Collins forced another tight-lipped smile. "Yes, I'm sorry for the trouble." Leonard let out a slow breath and stretched his legs before finally looking up at her. "You told us first class was full," he said in a calm voice. Miss Collins swallowed. She knew there was no way out of this situation, but she still had to keep her cool. "I may have spoken too quickly," she admitted. "I should have checked with the manifest before making that decision." Evelyn stayed seated. She hadn't even reached for her bag yet. She just looked up at Miss Collins and asked, "Why didn't you check?" Miss Collins stiffened. She hadn't expected that question to be asked in public. More people were watching and waiting. She wanted to say something, but the word got stuck in her throat. She knew exactly why she hadn't checked. She had thought they were just another elderly couple asking for special treatment, so she had ignored them. Leonard carefully watched her, his face blank. "You made an assumption." Miss Collins' fingers clenched at her sides. The silence between them weighed heavily on Evelyn's chest. She finally stood up, took her purse, and smiled at her husband before walking toward them. Evelyn said softly, "We weren't asking for special treatment. We were asking to be treated fairly." The words hit Miss Collins harder than she thought they would. She swallowed the bitter lump in her throat and stepped back as Evelyn took her seat next to Leonard. The moment should have passed, but it didn't. The other passengers were still watching, some whispering and shaking their heads. Miss Collins had never felt so small in her career, and it was only the beginning. Collins took a step back, clasping her hands tightly in front of her. The usual authority she carried in first class had got away, replaced by an uncomfortable stiffness in her posture. She could feel the weight of the passenger stares pressing against her, a silent judgment hanging in the air. Evelyn settled into her seat, adjusting her cardigan as if nothing had happened. Leonard, still calm, reached out and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. The ease with which they were acting made Miss Collins' stomach twist even more. They weren't bragging. Not demanding anything, they just let her show herself. A few rows away, Daniel, the younger flight attendant, had been watching. He had seen passengers complain and get angry over seat changes, but he had never seen a senior flight attendant have to backtrack like this. He looked at a businessman sitting next to him, who had also been watching, and the man raised an eyebrow as if to say, "That was awkward." Miss Collins cleared her throat and tried to get some air back. The words, "If there's anything else I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask," came out of nowhere, and Leonard leaned back in his seat, his face blank. "We'll be fine," Evelyn said, turning her attention to the window as if the conversation had never happened. Miss Collins hesitated for a moment longer, then quickly turned on her heel and walked back toward the galley. Her breath was shaky, but she didn't stop moving until she was behind the curtain and out of sight. Daniel, who was refilling people's drinks, looked at her and said that was something he said. He kept his voice neutral, and Miss Collins gave him a mean look and clenched her teeth. "I don't need commentary," Daniel said, holding up his hands. "You don't usually apologize to passengers." Miss Collins grabbed a napkin from the stack and rubbed her forehead. "I didn't have a choice," Daniel said, shrugging his shoulders against the counter. "That's what happens when you don't know who you're talking to." She had spent years controlling the first-class cabin, setting the tone, and choosing who got what amount of attention. She had turned away a lot of passengers after making snap decisions about them, but this time she had turned away the wrong people, and what was worse was she had no idea what else was coming. Miss Collins pressed her palms against the cold metal counter in the galley and took a sharp breath. Her heart was still racing, but she tried to look calm. The shame of having to say sorry in public stuck to her like a heavy coat. She had never had to swallow her pride like that, not in front of a whole cabin, not in front of her own crew. Daniel was still nearby, casually putting glasses on a tray, but he kept looking at her every once in a while. He said something about having a rough day, even though he knew she was already on edge. She shot him a cold look. "Not in the mood, Daniel." He smiled but said nothing. Miss Collins let out a breath, forcing her mind to refocus. She had made a mistake. Fine, it was over. A few people were sitting down, and she apologized. That was it. She just needed to make it through the rest of the flight without any more problems. She straightened her uniform as she left the galley and walked back into the first-class cabin. People were back to their reading, working on laptops, and drinking champagne, but there was a noticeable shift. She could feel it in the way a few of them glanced at her before quickly looking away. There was a slight tension that lingered like the aftermath of a storm that had passed but left its mark. She hated it. For years, she had been the silent authority on flights. Her presence alone was enough to keep things in order. But now, for the first time, she felt something new, a loss of control, and she wasn't sure how to deal with it. As she moved toward the front of the cabin, her eyes flickered to Leonard and Evelyn. They were bragging, Leonard had an unfolded newspaper in front of him, but it wasn't clear if he was reading it or just using it to avoid talking. They were too calm. Miss Collins had dealt with rude passengers before, people who complained about service, wanted better meals, or acted like they were more important than they really were. But Leonard and Evelyn were rude. They hadn't yelled at her or insisted she be punished. They had just let her actions get the best of them. Before she could get to the front of the cabin, the intercom went off again, saying, "Miss Collins, please report to the cockpit immediately." She stalked in the middle of a step, feeling a chill go through her. People were looking up and whispering to each other. Daniel, who had just walked into the aisle to get his glasses, raised an eyebrow. Miss Collins' throat felt tight, but she quickly turned on her heel and made her way back to the cockpit, her polished heels clicking against the carpet as she walked in. I could feel the tension in the air right away. Captain Hayes was sitting with his eyes fixed on Amanda Rhodes, who had her arms crossed and her face neutral but alert. The video screen was on again, but this time it wasn't just Benjamin Carter staring back at her. There were 2 other board members from Carter Airlines on it as well. Miss Collins' stomach twisted painfully as Benjamin spoke. His voice was still measured but noticeably colder than before. "I'd like to ask you." She swallowed and said, "Yes, sir." His eyes never left hers as he asked, "Are you aware that this flight is currently under executive review?" Her heart raced. Executive review only happened when major complaints were filed against an employee mid-flight. "I wasn't informed of that," she said, her voice barely steady. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. It had only begun a few minutes ago. He pointed to the board members on the screen and said, "Given what happened earlier, we've decided to keep a close eye on the rest of the flight." The words, "your employment I understand," nearly knocked the air out of her lungs. "Your employment I understand," she stuttered. Finally, an older woman with sharp glasses and a navy blue blazer spoke. "Miss Collins, your treatment of a first-class passenger was not only unprofessional, it was a complete failure of customer service. You didn't just refuse a request, you dismissed them. I didn't know who they were." Miss Collins tried to explain the woman's face. "That's exactly the problem. You made a snap decision about them. You thought they weren't important. How often do you make snap decisions like that?" Miss Collins opened her mouth, then shut it again. There was a long pause. Benjamin finally sighed and leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen, Miss Collins. You're going to go back to the cabin and finish the flight professionally. You're going to treat every passenger with the same level of courtesy that should have been shown to my parents." He started by saying, "Once we land, you will report to the executive office for a formal review of your position with this airline." Miss Collins felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to defend herself by saying she had worked for this airline for years, but there was nothing she could say that would change what had already happened. She had been so sure of herself earlier that she was being rude, and now she wasn't just losing control of the cabin, she was about to lose control of her life. Benjamin's voice was quieter when he spoke next, but it had more weight than before. "Let's see if you can make it through the rest of the flight without another mistake." The screen went dark, and Miss Collins stood still for a moment. Then Captain Hayes cleared his throat and said, "I'd suggest you get back to work, Miss Collins." As she stepped out of the cockpit, her legs felt weak, and she had never wanted to be on the ground more in her life. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat. The air in first class felt thicker, and the pressure of watching eyes was suffocating. She knew the passengers were paying attention, even if they pretended not to be. The people who had overheard her earlier were now sitting quietly amused, giving her sly looks as she made her way back. She wasn't just another flight attendant anymore, she was the one who tried to embarrass an airline couple, and now she was being investigated in the middle of the flight. She forced herself to do her job, but the back of her neck hurt from shame. She had always been in charge, the one everyone had to respect, and the one who set the rules for the flight. But now the power dynamic had changed, and she had never felt smaller. When she got to Leonard and Evelyn's row, she could feel their presence before she even looked up. Evelyn was still sitting comfortably in her seat, smoothing out the soft airline blanket over her lap. Leonard was calm as she spoke. Ever had a book open in front of him, but it was impossible to tell if he was reading it or just waiting. She cleared her throat and asked, "Would either of you like a refreshment?" Evelyn looked up with a nice but unreadable smile on her face. "Oh, now we're being served," she said. Miss Collins' stomach is turned. Leonard slowly turned the page of his book before looking up at her. "I'll have sparkling water," he said in a cool but polite voice. "Miss Collins," she said. "For you, Mrs. Carter." Evelyn tapped her chin thoughtfully and said, I think I'll have tea." Miss Collins quickly reached for the tea packets and made the drink with great precision. Evelyn kept her tone casual but serious. "You know, Leonard and I fly a lot. We've met a lot of flight attendants over the years. Some are wonderful, truly kind." She accepted the tea with a polite nod and then added softly, "And some forget that the people they serve are people, too." Miss Collins felt her pulse quicken. Leonard put down his book and adjusted his glasses. It's funny how quickly respect changes when people realize who they're talking to. Miss Collins swallowed Mr. Carter's eye. He held up a hand to stop her. She didn't need to explain, he just said, "You already did." Her mouth went dry. He wasn't yelling, demanding, or threatening her job. He was letting her sit in her own mistake. She gave a small nod and muttered, "Enjoy your drinks." She moved as quickly as she could without drawing more attention to herself, but the damage was already done. There were more murmurs in the cabin, and she didn't need to hear what was being said to know it. People who had been ignoring her before were now watching, some whispering to each other and others giving her small knowing smirks. A businessman near the front of the plane leaned toward his seatmate, saying, "This is better than in-flight entertainment." Miss Collins clenched her jaw and forced herself to keep moving. Daniel had been watching the whole thing from the back. A man a few rows away approached her as she went back to the galley. He had a neutral face, but something in his eyes bothered her. "Mind your own business," she told him, "mind your own business." He laughed and said, "Oh, it's not just my business. I'd say the whole cabin is invested at this point." She let out a sharp breath and rubbed her temples. "They want me gone, you think I don't know that?" Daniel shrugged and folded his arms. "I don't think they care if you're gone or..." "Not at all. I think they just wanted you to learn a lesson, and from where I'm standing, I can see that they did that." She wanted to snap back to get even a little of her old authority back, but what was the point? No one was listening to her anymore. She had lost control of this flight as soon as she fired the wrong people, and the worst part was that the flight wasn't even landing for hours yet. Miss Collins gripped the edge of the galley counter and heard the whispers, stolen glances. The look on the passengers' faces was unbearable. She had never been looked at so closely before. For years, she had walked through the first-class cabin with confidence, her authority unquestioned. She had been in charge of every flight she worked and set the tone. But now she was the subject of conversation, the story playing out in front of everyone's eyes, and she had no one but herself to blame. She took a deep breath, smoothed out her uniform, and reminded herself that this was just one flight. She told herself that once they got off the plane, she would calm down, talk to management about what happened, and hopefully the whole nightmare would end. But just as she started to catch her breath, Daniel came back into the galley and set down an empty tray with a smirk still on his lips. "You might want to get ready for round 2, he said lightly. Miss Collins stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Daniel asked. "It looks like Mr. Carter just made a call." She peered out from behind the galley curtain just in time to see Leonard putting away his phone. Leonard's face couldn't be read, but his influence was clear. Benjamin Carter had already issued a formal review mid-flight. What else was coming? Miss Collins had a bad feeling she was about to find out. A few minutes later, a small noise at the front of the plane broke the silence in first class. A well-dressed man in an airline operations suit walked in from the cockpit door, and people sat up. The people sitting next to Miss Collins' throat dried up as she recognized him right away. It was David Langford, an executive supervisor for in-flight operations. He wasn't just there by chance, he had been sent. David adjusted the cuffs of his suit and took a step toward Leonard and Evelyn's row. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced the whole cabin. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, I want to personally apologize on behalf of Carter Airlines for any disrespect or..." Miss Collins stopped breathing, and everyone turned their full attention to the couple. Some people stole glances at Miss Collins to see how she would react, waiting to see what would happen. Evelyn smiled warmly and said, "Oh, how kind of you, David. I assure you, my husband and I are quite comfortable now." Leonard leaned back slightly in his seat, but his expression couldn't be read. "It's good to see you, David. I trust everything is being handled properly." David nodded yes, sir, according to Mr. Benjamin Carter's instructions. Miss Collins' heart was pounding in her ears as she heard the words "official report." David didn't even look in her direction. Instead, he kept his voice steady and firm. As part of our service recovery policy, we've arranged a full luxury experience for you both upon landing, including private transportation, a stay at our premium partner hotel, and a formal in-person meeting with our executive team to address any concerns you may have, he said. Evelyn laughed softly. Well, that certainly is. Leonard gave a small nod and said, thanks. David hesitated for a moment before finally addressing the elephant in the room. As for the situation with our crew today, he said, finally turning his attention to Miss Collins. We take professionalism and respect for our passengers very seriously. I can assure you that further action will be taken once we land. Miss Collins felt her stomach twist into a painful knot as Daniel stood behind her in the galley. Some people whispered and smirked, and some looked downright happy about what was happening. Miss Collins tried to keep her cool, but she had never felt so exposed in her whole career. This wasn't just a complaint anymore, it was a public takedown, and it was happening in real time. David straightened his suit and turned back to Leonard and Evelyn. Let me know if there's anything else I can do for you during the rest of the flight, he said. Leonard smiled. David nodded and said, I'll go back to the cockpit for now. And with that, he was gone. There was a deafening silence. Miss Collins couldn't move. She couldn't even bring herself to walk away to act like she was still in charge of something, because it was clear she wasn't. She had gone from being in charge of first class to having no control over anything in her own cabin, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for the plane to land, where the real consequences were waiting. Miss Collins stood frozen in the aisle, her heart pounding against her ribs. The first-class cabin, which used to be a place where she held power, now felt like a stage, and she was the star of an embarrassing show. Other passengers weren't even pretending not to notice what had happened. Some laughed, others whispered, and some just stared, waiting to see how she would react. She had never been the one being watched before. She had always been the enforcer, the one keeping order. But now order had slipped. She was left standing in the aftermath of her own pride. Daniel, who was still in the galley behind her, said under his breath, "This is painful to watch." Miss Collins snapped her head at him, but she didn't say a word. He smirked but didn't push any further. He didn't need to. The damage was already done, and everyone knew it. She needed to move, do something, anything to regain even a shred of dignity, but she couldn't because she had been publicly reprimanded. Actions were written down in an official report, and worse, she was used as an example of how not to treat a passenger, not just any passenger, but the owners of the airline. It took a lot of willpower for her to move, and she stumbled stiffly toward the galley. She couldn't hide, but she could at least get out of sight. As she walked by Leonard and Evelyn, she half expected them to be proud and enjoy seeing her fall, but when she looked at them, Evelyn was calmly stirring her tea. Serene Leonard reopened his book and turned a page without a second glance. They had moved on, which made it even worse. Her fall from grace wasn't just embarrassing, it was unimportant to them. They weren't the type to enjoy making other people suffer. They didn't need revenge. They just let her destroy herself. She reached the galley and grabbed the counter, sharply exhaling. The silence in first class was different now. It wasn't awkward, it was satisfied. It made her sick. A voice behind her broke in. Daniel was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. This time, he wasn't mocking or smug. Instead, he looked curious. Miss Collins straightened her shoulders, ignoring the pain in her chest that was burning. "I'm fine," he said with a raised eyebrow. She didn't answer because she wouldn't give him the satisfaction, but Daniel wasn't done. He looked at her for a moment before speaking again, this time in a softer tone. "You know, if you just treated them like any other first-class passengers, none of this was going to happen," Miss Collins yelled. "You don't need to lecture me." Daniel shrugged. "Suit yourself. But I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's career is hanging by a thread. He paused, then added, and yours is unraveling by the second. Her stomach twisted violently. She already knew she didn't need Daniel to explain it to her. For the next hour, she did her job by serving drinks, adjusting trays, and talking to customers in a forced. Even though she was polite, her mind was stuck on what ifs. What if she had just checked the manifest? What if she had treated Leonard and Evelyn with the same patience she showed to the wealthier passengers? What if she had just taken one more second to think before dismissing them? Would she still be in this position? Would she still have a job when they got off the plane? She was afraid to know the answer. She didn't even realize how lost in thought she was until a familiar voice woke her up. El Carter had stepped into the cabin. When she turned around, he was watching her, not angry or smug, but curious. "You've been awfully quiet, Miss Collin," he said smoothly. "I'm just doing my job," she said stiffly, not sure how to respond. Mr. Carter. Leonard nodded as if that was taken into account. Then he asked the one question she wasn't ready for. "Do you regret how you handled things?" The words felt heavier than they should have. She wanted to defend herself and say she had been following the rules, but something in his face told her she shouldn't have. That wouldn't work because he wasn't asking for an excuse. He was asking her to be honest for the first time since the flight began. She hesitated. She wasn't sure what scared her more, his question or her answer. Miss Collins stood stiffly in the aisle, feeling every pair of eyes in first class waiting for her response. The passengers had been whispering but they were now eerily quiet, as if they knew this wasn't like any other awkward conversation. Leonard Carter had given her a reckoning. She had a chance to say she was wrong and save something before the plane landed and her future was ripped from her hands. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Did she regret how she had handled things? She should have said yes right away, but the problem was that she hadn't had to deal with regret in years because she had been running this taxi business and making snap decisions and assumptions about passengers. Most of the time they didn't fight back, they grumbled and gave up. She kept doing her job, but this time she made a mistake and fired the wrong people. Now she was standing in the aftermath, a broken woman in a uniform that no longer gave her any authority. Leonard raised an eyebrow at her hesitation, his face calm but unreadable. "I'll take your silence as an answer," he said, putting his hands in his pockets. Miss Collins' breath caught. She started to speak, but Leonard had already turned and walked back to his seat. The conversation was over, which was even worse. Passengers looked at each other, some shaking their heads and others smiling slightly as if they had been waiting for this moment. Daniel, who was standing near the galley, let out a sharp exhale and muttered, "Well." Miss Collins felt sick. She had spent years building a reputation that demanded respect and made her presence known in every cabin she worked, but now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. She turned sharply and stormed toward the galley, needing to get away. When she got to the back, she heard the intercom crackle to life again. "Miss Collins, please report to the cockpit." This time, passengers whispered to each other as she passed by, and the whispers got louder. They could feel that something else was about to happen. When she got to the cockpit door, she hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. As soon as she did, her stomach dropped. The video screen was on, and this time it wasn't just Benjamin Carter waiting for her, it was the whole crew. Carter Air's executive board had at least 10 high-ranking members seated at a long table across the screen. Some looked neutral, while others looked downright angry. Benjamin was the first to speak, telling Miss Collins, "Take a seat." Her knees almost buckled because there was no seat in the cockpit. This wasn't a meeting, it wasn't a discussion, it was a verdict. She wasn't going to make it to landing as a flight attendant. She was about to lose everything. The only sound in the cockpit was the instruments of the plane. The weight of the situation was pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being sentenced on the screen. Benjamin Carter clasped his hands together, his expression unreadable. Executives of Carter Airlines sat in stern silence, their eyes fixed on her as if she were a problem that needed to be dealt with. Miss Collins. Benjamin finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. We don't have much time left before the flight arrives, so let's get to the point. Miss Collins felt a chill down her spine. She had dealt with complaints before and been written up a few times for minor offenses, but this was something completely different. Benjamin leaned forward and said, "Your behavior on this flight was unacceptable, unprofessional, and in direct violation of Carter Airlines' customer service policies. Not only did you refuse a simple seating request, you did so with complete disregard for the..." One of the executives, a woman with neatly pinned black hair and sharp eyes, cut her off. "Miss Collins, you may not," she said firmly. "We've reviewed the flight logs, the crew reports, and multiple passenger statements, including those from other first-class travelers who witnessed your actions." She then looked down at a document in front of her and said, "From what we've gathered, you repeatedly showed bias and dismissal toward Mr. and Mrs. Carter." Without even checking to see who they were, Miss Collins clenched her hands together. "That's the problem," Benjamin said, shaking his head slightly. "That's exactly the problem, Miss Collins. You only see value in people you think are important. You made an assumption based on appearance alone, and now you're having to deal with the consequences." Her stomach twisted painfully. "Sir, I know I may have misjudged the situation, but I've worked for this airline for years and been a great flight attendant." "Respect," he said. "You've worked for this airline for years, and yet you never learned the most important part of customer service." His voice was steady but firm, and the word hung in the air like the last nail in the coffin. Miss Collins felt a lump form in her throat. She had lost all control. She couldn't talk her way out of it. Benjamin looked at one of the executives and gave her a small nod before saying, "After careful review, we've made a decision regarding your employment." The words, "You are hereby suspended indefinitely effective immediately upon landing," hit her like a punch in the gut. Suspended indefinitely made her mouth go dry, but the executive kept turning the page. "Given the severity of this situation and the nature of your actions, we are also placing you under formal review for permanent termination." Her body felt cold. "This couldn't be happening, sir." She tried to explain, but her voice wasn't clear and confident, it was desperate. "I understand I should not have thrown them off, but I was just following the rules." "Miss Collins," Benjamin said in a steely voice, "rules don't excuse bias, rules don't excuse making passengers feel like they don't belong. You had every chance to check the manifest to make sure they had tickets to show them the same courtesy you show others, and you didn't." Collins' throat burned. She had spent years teaching new flight attendants how to command respect in the cabin, but now she had none left. If this had been a one-time thing, maybe she could have been let off the hook, but it wasn't. Miss Collins blinked, and Benjamin turned to another executive and pulled up a file of past complaints. "Miss Collins, over the last 2 years, multiple passengers have reported similar treatment from you, including being fired, talked down to, or denied basic accommodations without proper verification. Your file contains more internal complaints than most employees' files combined," the executive said. Throughout their careers, flight attendants have heard complaints, but Miss Collins never thought they would be stacked against her. Benjamin tapping his finger on the desk in front of him was the last straw for Miss Collins, who felt dizzy and like she was losing everything. Benjamin's voice softened, but it wasn't out of sympathy, it was final. "I hope this serves as a lesson, Miss Collins, because the truth is you didn't lose your job today because Because of who my parents are. He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. You lost your job because of who you are. The screen went dark, and she stood there, her chest rising and falling quickly, but she had nothing more to say. Captain Hayes broke the suffocating silence by clearing his throat. You should return to your post for the remainder of the flight, he said, but there was no warmth in his voice. When we land, security will escort you off the aircraft. Miss Collins didn't move. In just a few hours, the sharp, competent woman who had stepped onto the plane was gone, and in her place was someone she didn't recognize. Miss Collins stepped out of the cockpit, her legs moving on their own while her mind went into a haze of disbelief. She wasn't sure if she was breathing. Her career, years of work, sense of authority, and whole identity had just crumbled in front of her, and she was being reviewed for permanent termination. Her hands were clenched. As she walked stiffly down the aisle, each step felt heavier than the last. She could still feel the passengers' attention shifting toward her as if she were walking disaster. She had been in charge of the flight, but now she was barely a part of it. Daniel was standing near the galley with his arms crossed, watching her approach. She knew what he was going to say before he even spoke. Well, he said, that looked intense. Miss Collins gave him a glare, but she didn't have the strength to say anything. Snap back, she walked past him looking at the gas station and trying to calm down. Daniel didn't move, but he also didn't let her brush him off so easily, so he stayed leaning against the counter. That little meeting wasn't what I think it was? She let out a sharp breath and grabbed the counter. Drop it, Daniel. He whistled lowly, yes, and she said, drop it. Daniel let out a small laugh and shook his head. You know, I almost feel bad for you. She turned to face him. You almost feel bad for me, said Daniel. He didn't change his expression. Instead, he looked genuinely interested. Yeah, he said with a shrug. It must be awful going from untouchable to unemployed all in one flight. Her chest tightened in pain. The words hurt more than she wanted to admit. Daniel's voice became more thoughtful. But here's the thing, Collins. You've been treating people this way for years. You fired passengers, made them feel bad, and walked through this cabin like you were better than everyone else. He leaned in a little and lowered his voice just enough to be understood. That only she could hear, and the one time it backfires you expect sympathy. Miss Collins swallowed hard. She hated how the words hit her like poison. Daniel wasn't making fun of her. He was right. She had built her reputation on being unbending, untouchable, and feared, and now she was none of those things. Passengers who used to avoid eye contact now stared at her, and some whispered, but she knew exactly what they were saying. That's her, the flight attendant who was embarrassed, the one who tried to throw. She lost all of her authority and didn't know who she was talking to. Miss Collins turned away from Daniel and grabbed a stack of napkins, pretending to organize them, to keep herself busy. Daniel breathed out through his nose, and I'll let you think about that. He then turned and walked down the aisle with a sense of ease. Unlike her, he had his job, the respect of the passengers, and no worries about what would happen when the plane landed. The next 30 minutes went by quickly. She went through the motions of her job, but her hands didn't feel like they were connected to the rest of her body when she refilled glasses or cleared plates. No one thanked her, and people barely acknowledged her presence. On flights like this before, she was respected and even feared. Now, she was nothing. She could hear small conversations going on around her. Some people tried to act normal by watching movies on their laptops and drinking champagne, while others were still amazed at what they were seeing. A woman near the front whispered to her husband, "She was so rude before, and now look at her, she deserves it." The man whispered back, "Can you imagine how many people she's treated like that?" Another passenger laughed under his breath, "I'd be getting out free drinks if I were her. Maybe try to get some good customer reviews before she loses her job. Miss Collins felt every word like a needle in her skin. She gripped the tray so tightly that it was the longest flight of her life, and she just wanted it to be over. She wanted to get off the plane and disappear, but she couldn't because just as she thought the worst was over, Leonard Carter stood up. Passengers saw Evelyn raise an eyebrow at him and turn her head toward him, but she didn't say anything. As he adjusted his jacket and walked toward the front of the cabin, Miss Collins stopped in her tracks. He wasn't going to the bathroom or stretching his legs. Leonard stalked a few feet away, hands in his pockets, and looked at her with the same unreadable expression he had been wearing for most of the flight. For a brief, desperate moment, she thought about running to the galley, but what good would that do? She couldn't run away from this anymore. Leonard tilted his head slightly and studied her. He said, "I've been thinking about something," but Miss Collins felt the world tilt. "Sir." He didn't say that. He looked around the cabin instead, letting the moment linger so that everyone could watch. Finally, he spoke. "I've flown thousands of times in my life and met hundreds of flight attendants. Most of them were kind, professional, and respectful." He let the words sit there heavy and deliberate, and then he continued, "There were ones like you." The air cracked with tension, and Miss Collins felt her throat tighten. Leonard took a slow step forward and asked, "Miss Collins, when you looked at me and my wife earlier when you scolded us when?" His eyes were fixed on hers, asking, "Who did you think we were?" She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "That's what I thought." Miss Collins felt her whole body flush with shame. Leonard nodded once, then turned and walked back to his seat without saying another word. Passengers stared at him, and one even shook his head with a look that said, "You brought this on yourself." Miss Collins felt like she had been burned alive, and the worst part was, she knew she would never be able to get on another plane without remembering this moment. She would always be known as the flight attendant who thought she was untouchable until she wasn't. Leonard Carter's words weighed on Miss Collins like a suffocating fog. He had destroyed her without raising his voice, without anger, and without the need for insults. He had let her fall apart under the weight of her own mistakes, and now she had to live in that moment. She stood still with her tray in hand as Leonard Carter. Evelyn gave her husband a small smile as he sat back down, but she didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. There was complete silence in the cabin for a few unbearable seconds before the whispers started up again. People weren't even trying to be quiet anymore, they were being rude. Miss Collins deserved it. I wish I had recorded that because I could feel their words cutting into her, making her realize that she wasn't invisible, that she wasn't just another flight attendant walking through the. She had been the center of attention for a long time, so she forced herself to move. As she adjusted her tray, her hands shook slightly as she tried to look busy, ignoring the fact that her skin burned from all the attention, her head hurt, her heartbeat was too fast, and her breasts felt wrong, too shallow, too unsteady. She had been humiliated at work and in her personal life, and what made it even worse was that she had lost who she thought she was for. For years, she walked through first-class cabins like she was in charge, thinking that everyone had to respect her. She had trained herself to be untouchable, to never waver, and to never second-guess her decisions. But today, she had lost everything. People no longer feared her, they no longer tried to impress her, they just pied her. She had become a small, disposable item. She had spent years thinking she had control over this cabin, the people in it, and everything around her, but all it took was one decision or assumption to. Daniel went back to the galley behind her and leaned casually against the counter with a face that couldn't be read. For once, he didn't look smug or gloating, and he was watching her with an expression that couldn't be read. Miss Collins' throat tightened, but she wouldn't let him see her break. She kept her back straight and her face blank, but Daniel knew better. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said in a lower voice. "I know exactly how you're feeling right now." She didn't answer. "I've seen flight attendants lose their jobs before, but I've never seen someone self-destruct like that in the middle of a flight." Her fingers curled into her palm. "If you're here to gloat, don't do it," she said. "I'm not gloating." He hesitated, then said, "But I am wondering something." She looked at him, annoyed. "If you could go back to the beginning of this flight, what would you do differently?" he asked. "If you could do anything differently," she snapped. "It doesn't matter now." Daniel raised an eyebrow. She wanted to lash out and say something sharp to end the conversation before it went any further, but she couldn't because she really did regret everything. She regretted not checking the manifest, her tone, her assumptions, and how quickly she fired two people who had done nothing to deserve it. She regretted not realizing how easy it would be to replace her, because that's what she was now, replaceable. She had always thought she was valuable, that the airline needed her, they couldn't afford to lose her authority and the way she ran the cabin, but now she was a liability, and soon she'd be nothing at all. Daniel let out a soft breath and said, "You know what's the deal with people like Leonard Carter?" Miss Collins didn't answer. Daniel leaned against the counter and watched her carefully. "They don't have to raise their voice," he said. "They don't have to get angry. They don't have to punish you." He pointed to the cabin. "The real punishment is living with the fact that you did this to yourself." Collins looked down at her hands for the first time in her career. She had no defense, no excuse, no power, nothing. She just knew she had made the biggest mistake of her life and there was no going back from it. Miss Collins had never been the type to second-guess herself. She had built her career on the belief that she belonged in first class, in charge of the passengers and the experience with an ironclad grip. But now that she was in the galley, she had lost all of her confidence. She had spent years thinking that she was important, that people had to listen to her, and that her word was final. But as she turned her head a little, she saw Leonard and Evelyn Carter sitting quietly talking as if nothing had happened, as if her whole world hadn't just fallen apart. She thought they were still watching her, reveling in her downfall, but they weren't thinking about her at all. That realization hit her harder than anything else. Their lack of interest in her downfall didn't matter to them. The worst thing wasn't that she was losing her job, it was that she had never been important in the first place. She let out a shaky breath and gripped the counter behind her as she felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore, it was a deeper, hollow, sinking feeling that told her this wasn't just one mistake, it was a pattern. How many people had she ignored over the years? How many passengers had she walked past without even glancing? She thought about the business travelers who had her full attention, the rich, well-dressed men and women whose needs she had put ahead of everyone else's. Then she thought about all the other people, the elderly people she had ignored when they needed help with their bags, the young mother who had asked for an extra blanket for her toddler and been met with a sigh and an eye roll, and the nervous first-time flyer she had written off as an inconvenience instead of a person. She thought about them all. She hated the person she had become. She had spent years looking down on others, and now everyone was looking down on her. For the first time in her career, she knew what it was like to be helpless. Daniel had gone back to work and was walking down the aisle with ease. He didn't have to force his presence or demand respect. He just did his job, and people liked him, trusted him, and looked him in the eye when they spoke to him. She had spent years looking down on others, and now everyone was. She had thought for years that respect came from being in charge, but now she knew it came from something else entirely. Daniel had earned it, she had forced it, and now that she had lost it, she knew the difference. She turned her head slightly to watch Daniel offer a passenger a refill and make a short, funny comment that made the man laugh. It was something so simple that she had once thought wasn't important, but that was the job. It wasn't about being in charge, it was about being of service. She had never understood that until now, and it was too. She had spent so much time pretending to be untouchable, thinking that her seniority would protect her, but no one was untouchable, not her, not anyone else. Her hands shook as she tried to hold herself together as she adjusted a stack of napkins. She had never felt so exposed before. The whispers in the cabin weren't as loud as they had been before, but she could still hear them. She had become a spectacle, a lesson for everyone on board, and the flight wasn't even over yet. She heard footsteps. When she turned around, it wasn't a passenger but Evelyn. Miss Collins' stomach tightened, and she straightened up right away, forcing her face to look neutral, but she couldn't hide the shame in her eyes. Evelyn Carter wasn't smiling, she wasn't being smug or mean, and she looked thoughtful. She held her tea in one hand and rested the other at her side. She didn't say anything right away, just watched Miss Collins with a quiet, thoughtful look. Miss Collins hated how it made her feel, so Evelyn finally sighed and shook her head. "Dear," she said in a soft but firm voice, "I don't think you're a bad person." Miss Collins' throat went dry, she hadn't expected kindness. Evelyn kept adjusting her grip on her cup, "But I do think you got lost somewhere along the way." Miss Collins stiffened, she didn't want to hear this now, not when she was already lost. Evelyn took a sip of her tea and looked directly into Miss Collins's eyes. "Do you remember what I said earlier about how?" Evelyn tilted her head and said, "Some flight attendants are great." Miss Collins did remember. Miss Collins clenched her jaw, but she couldn't argue because Evelyn was right. Her fingers were tensely rubbing against the fabric of her uniform, pulling at every muscle in her body. She wanted to disappear, wake up, and undo everything, but she couldn't. She could only stand there and take it. Evelyn gave her a long, thoughtful look and said, "It's not too late to be better," she said quietly, "but that's up to you." She then turned around and walked back to her seat, as if she hadn't just shattered Miss Collins's whole worldview with one conversation. As she walked away, Miss Collins felt something strange and unfamiliar twisting in her chest. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just mad at the consequences, she was mad at herself, and that realization hurt the most. Miss Collins stood in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that Evelyn's words lingered in the air. "It's not too late to be better, but that's up to you." She didn't know why those words affected her so much. Maybe it was because no one had ever told her that before. It didn't matter. The flight was about to land, and her fate, which she had spent years trying to avoid, would be sealed. Security would be waiting, and she would be let out in her uniform, which had become a symbol of her authority. Her career was over, but there was still something that haunted her. The thought of losing her job wasn't the worst thing, it was realizing that this wasn't just about today or one mistake, it was about who she had been for years. She thought about past flights and the frustrated or embarrassed looks on the faces of passengers she had ignored, the times she had picked arrogance over kindness and power over respect. She had believed for years that authority meant being above others, but today showed her she was wrong because real power doesn't come from being above others. She felt sick for the first time and wondered what might have been different if she had just been better. Would she still be on this flight? Would she still have a future with this airline? Would she be respected instead of feared? Daniel went back to the galley and adjusted his uniform. "We're beginning to set," he said casually. She barely nodded and stared down at the counter for a moment. Daniel studied her for a moment before leaning slightly. Tilting his head, he said, "I thought you'd be fighting this harder." Miss Collins didn't answer because she realized something scary. She wasn't fighting it anymore because she knew she deserved it. Daniel exhaled and rubbed his chin. "So what now?" she asked, out of breath. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. For the first time in years, she had no control over what happened next, and maybe that was the point. Daniel raised an eyebrow, almost impressed by her honesty. For the rest of the descent, she did her job without any commands, harsh orders, or overcompensating. There was just silence. And then there was the landing. The plane touched down smoothly and rolled down the runway. Passengers moved in their seats, unbuckling their seat belts and stretching to check their phones. For M. Collins, it was just another flight. It was the last flight of her career. She watched as Leonard and Evelyn Carter sat there patiently while the other people in the cabin gathered their things. Her heart raced. This was it. She took a step forward, forcing her legs to move. When she reached Leonard and Evelyn's row, she stopped for a moment. She thought about walking away and letting them leave without saying anything, but something inside her wouldn't let her. She turned to them, swallowed hard, and forced herself to face the people who had changed everything. Leonard met her eyes evenly, and Evelyn just waited. For the first time in years, she let go of her pride and said, "I'm sorry." The words felt strange in her mouth. Evelyn tilted her head slightly and studied her for what Miss Collins felt her throat tighten for everything I've been, for how I've treated you and how I've treated others. She exhaled. "I thought respect came from power, but I was wrong." Leonard watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. Evelyn smiled softly. "That's a good start," Evelyn said simply. Miss Collins, even though she didn't expect forgiveness and maybe didn't deserve it, she did something she had never thought she would do in a long time. She admitted she was wrong. Leonard gave her a small nod before standing up and adjusting his blazer. Evelyn Rose also started gathering her things, and they walked past her without saying anything else. They had already moved on. Miss Collins watched them leave, the weight of everything pressing into her chest. She didn't know what her future held, but she did know. One thing was for sure, she would never be the same person she was before the flight. And maybe that was the real consequence, the one she would have to live with for the rest of her life. If you think this flight attendant got what she deserved, click like and let us know in the comments what you think. Was the punishment fair? If you like stories where justice is done, make sure to subscribe for more videos like this.